Welcome back to Agree to Argue. And I am super excited about today's show because the last time we had the conversation about slavery, we couched it as is God pro slavery? And I think that Dr. Josh raised a really good pushback to that because it was really hyperbole. That really wasn't a fair question to couch a dialogue about because, he's not saying, and the non-theist community is not saying that God is pro-slavery. Yes, go out and get slaves. That's what we want. But rather, why didn't God condemn slavery? And Steve really kind of made me think when he said, God clearly just stated, don't eat shellfish, don't blend fabrics. So just as succinctly and clearly could he have not said, don't own slaves. So I'm really glad to welcome Dr. Josh back. And we also have Joe Miller joining us to broaden the conversation. And of course, as always, Fuzz and Steve are going to be jumping in. And this is going to be a great conversation. And again, thanks and a reminder for following us on social media. We have had some really good interactions this past month about the topic. Steve, I know that we had on ATA's social media, we had some really good interactions, but I know that there was the one that you shared that had your picture of saying, why didn't God just say? And boy, that got some traction on your Facebook, yeah?
Yeah, it did. It was actually really well done. I love whoever's doing the artwork. Props to them. Although one person did note something that I hadn't thought about at the time. And they thought that I was actually stipulating that, hey, slavery is okay and it's good and we should have slaveries because God didn't explicitly condemn it. I'm like, no, that's not at all what I was saying.
Okay, that's pretty awesome. I love it. Isn't that what we have?
I was like, no, let's walk that back a little bit. Let me kind of explain the context here because she didn't understand the context because it's like, well, is this person saying that slavery is good? I'm like, no.
Yeah, no, that's not what
no,
we're saying. So yeah, just a reminder for everybody to follow us on social media. Go to look for Agree to Argue and subscribe to YouTube. And this time, I want to lay out some things that kind of got muddled and a little bit lacked clarity last time. I noted that there was some back and forth on both sides about talking about slaves and if they were more like indentured servants and or if it was like chattel slavery, and there were examples given back and forth. And what I would like is Dr. Josh, in just a moment, if you wouldn't mind helping us delineate between Israelite slaves and foreign slaves and what the difference is. And maybe we can discipline ourselves that whichever we're referring to when we're talking in scripture, when we're referring to a passage, if we can kind of make that clear. Are we talking about Israelite slaves or are we talking about foreign slaves? I think that will help track and not conflate the two. And then also, Steve posited the question that why would you give guidelines to something that you don't want people to do? So I know that kind of reflects back to the shellfish and the blending of fabrics, but at the same time, it's like, okay, if you're gonna do it, then do it this way. So I'm sure, Joe, you and Fuzz are ready to take that portion of the conversation on. So let's start with Dr. Josh. Help us to understand the two different types of slaves, and then we'll go into Leviticus 25 a little bit.
Sure. So part of the difficulty, I think, with trying to, in particularly places like Exodus 21, to try to delineate, okay, this is talking about a debt slave and this is talking about a chattel slave. So I think for the most part, it's talking about debt slaves, but the language isn't precise in that sense, right? So you can't just use the Hebrew word eved to determine whether it's a chattel slave or a debt slave. It's all contextually based. So, what most scholars would say about how to define slavery in the ancient world is they would mostly make the distinction between debt slaves and chattel slaves. So, debt slaves are just any slave that their slavery is contingent upon the repayment of a debt, and is theoretically not a permanent situation. And then chattel slavery is, one that is not, contingent upon a debt. So it's really that, I think it's really that simple. So the big passages like Exodus 21, 20 to 21, probably talking about debt slaves. I think we have pretty good parallels in other ancient Near Eastern texts that talk about similar situations. So I like, there are people like Gregory Kirikigno in his 93 volume, I think in the JSOT series. Like, he lays out all the different people that have different opinions on whether that's chattel slavery or debt slavery. But I think it's probably debt slavery. Definitely when you get into Deuteronomy 15, you're definitely talking about Israelite debt slaves there. Certainly you're talking about Israelite debt slaves in Exodus 21 verses 2 to 6 and then 7 through 11.
So, and not just the location of the debt slave versus the chattel slavery, but what would be the difference about how the two might be treated?
Yeah, so debt slaves, generally speaking, are treated a little bit better, and the rationale, and that's not just in the Hebrew Bible, just generally in the ancient Near East, they're not considered strict property. And so, if you look at the laws of Hammurabi, for example, you have a distrainee, someone who's taken as a distraint in order to, motivate somebody to pay off a debt or to have them serve until they pay off their debt. Those people are not considered permanent possessions, right? The master owns the work, not so much the individual. So that they tend to get treated a little bit better. So you have the places that you can tell where it's clearly Israelite debt slaves is where it says it, right? So Exodus 21, 2 to 6, it talks about an Eved Ivri, so the Hebrew slave. Deuteronomy 15, very explicit, Hebrew slave. And then, of course, in Leviticus 25, you can't have them as slaves anymore, the Israelites as slaves. And that's where you really get precise chattel slavery explained. So verses 44 to 46, and I'll stop talking because I know you said keep it short. But yeah, that's where it's talking about foreign slaves, and they're not contingent upon a debt. So.
Okay, so Fuzz, I was going to ask you to jump in there.
And I appreciate the point that you're making. Hey, let's clarify what we mean when we use the terms. And, I very much respect and appreciate Josh showing up on our show, and very much respect his work and his scholarship. And to me, I think when you look at the word that's used in the original Hebrew, that's referring to both Hebrew and non-Hebrew, Eved, or slaves, although I don't particularly like that word slave, but it's really Eved in both instances, or in all the instances that I've seen. And, there is actually, there are biblical scholars who argue that it's not slavery, it's not chattel slavery that's being described for both Hebrew and non-Hebrew, quote unquote slaves, but it's actually bond servanthood or bond service. And so, like in the King James, it's always translated as bond servant as opposed to slave. And and again, I'm a biochemist. I'm not a biblical scholar, but I am a student of the Bible, and I've read extensively as much as I could on this. And sadly, there's not a lot about slavery in the Old Testament that's really available, or at least available for broad consumption. So I very much appreciate the fact that Josh has put together a really good book on this issue. But for example, Isaac Allen, who was an interesting writer, biblical scholar, writing around the time of the Civil War, making the case that there is no such thing as chattel slavery being taught in the Bible, which was really significant for that time. Here's a book that I have from a Hebrew scholar. This was published in 1898 Moses Milesiner, who actually argues again that there's no chattel slavery being taught in the Old Testament. And and so I think you could make a case that it's actually not chattel slavery, but it's really bond service. And really, what distinguishes between the Hebrew and the non-Hebrew is, for the Hebrew, that bond servants actually ends at 7 years, whereas for the foreigner or the non-Hebrew, it could extend essentially for that individual's lifetime.
Was that the conclusion of your thought there, Fuzz?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I want to go ahead and jump in. And Joe, if you could, first of all, you have a absolutely great Hebrew shirt there.
Thank you. Made it myself.
You're welcome. And just wanted to have you introduce yourself a little bit and like your expertise in this area and what you bring into the table, and weigh in your thoughts on this, because I think this is pretty significant right out of the gate. If there really is no delineation between the types of slavery, if you agree with that, disagree with that, and again, what is your background and how it qualifies you to speak on this?
Yeah, so my real quick background, the thumbnail sketches, 20 some years in a lot of pastoral ministry. Went through multiple degrees and master's degrees in different things, from philosophy of science to theology. Have a DMin and mostly ministry, leadership kind of things. But I'm doing my PhD right now in ethics. And so kind of focus on that ethics side. And a lot of my research really is into this idea of B'Tselem Elohim, which is the shirt, this idea of we're all made in the image of God and human sacredness. So I get into these studies of, the question, why didn't God condemn slavery? And as an ethicist guy, and as a guy who's looking at a lot of Old Testament passages and studying these things, especially in light of racial issues in the United States, which has been a lot of my focus. These are pretty critical issues because of how a lot of these old passages were used to justify slavery. And so I would say that one important distinction that's worth noting, and this comes from Peter Williams, great scholar. He does some work with Cambridge. He's an ESV translation guy. So he has a great talk on some of this stuff. But he notes that like in the later 20th century, so in the late 1900s, you had this plethora of English translations, but not just English. Actually, he looked at like a dozen translations in these Western languages like Spanish, Dutch, German, all these. And they started to translate Eved as with the word slave or slavery. And that wasn't used prior to those times in older translations. And so I think, and this is my take on it, this short take on this is, I think what you have, based on a lot of other studies that I've done in this area, you had a lot of people, whether intentionally or unintentionally, looking through these ancient, systems of service and reinterpreting it through the lens of a modern worldview of slavery. Some may be to justify it, some may be to condemn it. They might have different motives of why, but I think they start to do that in the modern translations, and we lose that nuance. And I think that's what Dr. Josh was talking about, that nuance of the word Eved and what it brings. Because, in some cases, we have texts that talk about, being the Eved of God, where it's a blessing. You're blessed to be God's Eved, his bond slave or bond servant, however you want to translate that. And so we have, in ancient Near East, with hospitality being so important, when somebody came and a stranger to your home, the homeowner became the Eved of the stranger. They became the servant of the slaver. So it really depicts this relationship of service that can have very negative meanings and very positive meanings. It just depends on the context. And so I think that's something to just note and be careful of. So, and I think that's why the Bible doesn't condemn slavery in the way we would like it. Because to condemn slavery was really impossible, because the word had a lot of meanings, that some were good and some were bad. But in our meaning, it's always bad. And so I think that's where the miscue comes. Hopefully that makes some sense.
Yeah, it does. Go ahead, Fuzz.
Yeah, and to this whole question, does the Bible condemn slavery? And I would really be curious to hear Josh interact with this. I actually think the Bible does condemn slavery, and it's not so much what we would read through in Exodus, Leviticus, or Deuteronomy, but it's when you go elsewhere in Scripture. For example, if you look at the prophets, Amos is condemning Tyre, Gaza, and Israel for essentially engaging in the acts of slavery. Jeremiah is condemning Judah for not releasing bond servants after 7 years and turning this bond service into actual slavery. Isaiah also is condemning slavery in Isaiah 58 and 61, though it's implicit. And then, of course, if you go to the Apostle Paul, there's clear statements of condemnation against slavery that in his letter, for example, to Timothy in 1 Timothy. And so this is significant because the prophets are speaking on behalf of God. They're God's mouthpiece, and they are using the laws that you see in Exodus, Deuteronomy, and Leviticus as the standard by which to justify the condemnation. Likewise, Paul is a Hebrew's Hebrew. He's a biblical scholar, a Hebrew scholar who is looking at, again, the law to essentially justify this condemnation of slavery. So that means that what's going on in Exodus, Deuteronomy, and Leviticus must be something very different than slavery. It must be describing social systems that are slavery.
You froze up there a little bit at the end. We're looking at very different. What was that?
It's something very different social systems. They're not
okay.
Other than slavery. That would
and it's funny because right out of the gate, I'm hearing three different things, and I could be wrong. I'm hearing abed. Is that what it is? That it's used really in one way as a bondservant, and I'm also hearing that it's the same word, but depending on the context is positive or negative. And then I'm also hearing that there are two distinctly different types of slaves, and that's chattel versus bondservant. And so Steve and Dr. Josh, go ahead. Y'all I'm going to back out now and let you all do a cannonball into the deep end. I know that we were going to unpack Leviticus 25 a little bit and ask the question why Christians stop at a certain point and then not look at the rest. But why don't you guys go ahead and go for it?
Let me ask Dr. Josh, as a person who's not a biblical student, I'm just not by any means. In modern day society, right? And I understand, Joe's point about cultural relativism and how maybe we are looking through the lens of modernity to things way back when. But as somebody who likes ethics, I kind of hold that certain things are just wrong, right? I mean, slavery and owning property and beating people is inherently immoral, and we can get to the ethical reasons for that. But my question would be, in today's society, at least in America, we have rules that tell us what we cannot do, right? And if something is not expressed explicitly in the rule of law, it's considered to be permissible or legal, right? So our law system is set up basically is that laws don't tell us what we can do; they tell us what we can't do, right? So how was it back then in the days of Scripture for the Bible and God? Was it set up more that the commandments were what you can do, what is morally permissible, or what was morally impermissible? Because like the commandments seem a little bit of each, right? But it does say like thou shalt not do this, thou shalt not commit murder, right? It doesn't say thou shalt not commit murder, but under these circumstances you can, and here's the guidelines to do it. So how did the rule of law work back then?
It's a complicated question in this discussion because there are two aspects. There's what's in the narrative itself and what is the ancient Near Eastern genre. I would make that distinction. I'm not sure if Joe and Fuzz would make that distinction, but case law is essentially how the ancient Near East does its legal system, at least in these law collections that we see. So it's essentially calling attention to things, situations where if this happens, then this is what you will do. So in the biblical text, the way that the narrative is set forth, these are commandments from on high, saying, if your slave does X, and you do Y, then Z will be the result or whatever. So people could look if they want to get sort of into legal aspects of ancient Near Eastern law. Ray Westbrook is like probably the place to go. If you go to our website, you'll see I've got a bibliography there for everybody. But yeah, it's a complicated answer. I wanted to just kind of walk quickly back through mostly what you guys talked about. So 1 Timothy 1:10, I think I heard you talk about that. That's talking about slave trade, and that was a vice everywhere. There are lots of vice lists in the period of the New Testament that also include that. So it's not talking about slavery; it's talking about slave trade, which is very different. Jeremiah 34, as you said, is not condemning slavery; it's condemning not abiding by the law, which was release the slaves, the Israelite slaves, after 6 years, which is not what they did. Amos, I think it's Amos 1 and Amos 8, just pulling that from memory. Sorry if I'm getting those wrong. But also talking about the mass capture and then resale of I think it's the Edomites that they did that too. It's been a while since I've looked at it. But again, it's not slavery. It's like mass capture of entire populations to make a profit off of them. So, I mean, we have to distinguish between those things. And last thing about the use of the word eved. So there's no question that, from the point of view of like lexicography, everything is defined by its context. So my nose runs, I run, my car runs, the refrigerator runs. Like, I guess the car and refrigerator are about the same, but all those things are distinguished by context. Eved is the same way, and it's not just eved. The word slave in the ancient Near East is often just sort of the same in Semitic. So when you look at the Amarna letters, for example, in the 14th century, kings of vassal states in Syro-Palestine write to the pharaoh and say, "Your slave," right? Your slave to the king. So he's not a slave proper. That being said, that doesn't mean that you can make any kind of blanket assertion at all. I'm not suggesting that you guys were doing that, but like we have to be very careful to not only not say, well, it says eved here, so that means it must mean slave, in the sense that we think about it, but we also can't say, well, it says eved, and since eved's good over here, it can't be eved here. Like, it can't be the bad kind of slavery here. And I don't think there's any question. Like, I know Pete Williams, and I know that video you're talking about. Like, I think he's a New Testament scholar, but I'm not sure about that.
Yeah, I think that's his official status, I think.
But I mean, like, I think this idea of later translations, being more liberal and wanting to read, I just like flatly disagree with that. I mean, the definitions, if you go, and I will shut up after this. If you go look at, there's a 2018 Oxford, or maybe it's 2020 Oxford legal texts of the Hebrew Bible or something like that, laws in the Hebrew Bible, big, thick. I mean, they're going through and setting definitions based on the primary text themselves. So
now,
okay.
If anybody can jump in here, because I'm not sure who would be the best to comment on this. I think that where we get into a real clear difference is the year of Jubilee, like how slaves are to be treated, because I think that really lends itself towards the Christian argument that these slaves weren't treated as what we picture, especially here in the Americas with chattel slavery, just the property and the abuse that happened. So if you comment on Jubilee, but then side by side, keep going back to the sticking point. If you beat this person almost to death, as long as they survive, that's okay because they are your property. So how do you reconcile those two of, this person is treated like a member of the household. It's only for a short period of time. It's to pay off a debt or whatever, versus this other situation over here. And as well as if the master gives the slave or the servant or whatever a wife, and they have a child, he's the one. It's because it sounds very nice. It's like you're released after, at the year of Jubilee. It sounds very nice, but it's like you can go, but your wife and kid is staying. That definitely sounds like a property thing. So that's a lot to unpack if anybody wants to jump into that.
Yeah, I would just want to jump in and say, I think regarding the law, because that question about the law came up, and I think this will tie in hopefully, is, there are many things in the Old Testament where the law certainly did, I think, regulate things. It doesn't necessarily mean that those things were morally good just because it regulates them. For example, we can look at that from the example of Jesus in the New Testament. And he says to the Pharisees and to the Sadducees, to the leaders, hey, look, the only reason God permitted divorce to begin with was because of the hardness of your heart. Even in the Old Testament, we see that God had never intended Israel to have a king, yet because of the hardness of their heart, he allowed them to have a king. So God allowed for many things that he did not find morally good or right, because the purpose of the law was not only to point out right and wrong and good and bad, those sort of things, but it was also to point to help kind of train the people within their cultural context to understand the pursuit of holiness of God is beyond any specific rules that, because you can always come up with the exception. I mean, in ministry for a lot of years, if I ever told kids, there was always these things, you could go in, we had these summer events when I lived in Washington. And they said, okay, you got to have these conversations about, what are appropriate bathing suit attire for girls and all this stuff. I said, look, I'm not giving specifics, because if I tell you one thing, there's something else. And first of all, I don't think that's appropriate for me to judge what they're wearing anyway. That's kind of creepy, actually. But anyway, when you set these rules, people just find a way, there's this way around it. And so the more pervasive a legal system is, I think it demonstrates the immorality of culture, not the morality of a culture. Because you don't make laws against things that aren't happening. So if no one's ever raped somebody, you don't make a law against rape because it never happened within a society. So I think there's a different way of looking at the law in that. And I say that because I think when we look at what's happening here in the Old Testament, what we see is that God is condemning not the system of Eved, but he is condemning the oppression and the dehumanization of others who are made in the image of God. And he has the plan and the strategy for that may not be the way we would do it, but it's the way I think God had it, where he had it associated with household. You can see, like, for example, in Exodus 40:23, because this flows in with the theme. I know we were talking about Leviticus 25, and Yahweh's talking about freeing Israel and out of Egypt, and a parallel passage I see from that is Exodus 4:22-23. It says, God saying, look, hey, Pharaoh, he says, thus says the Lord of Israel to the firstborn son, and I say to you, let my son go that he may serve, he may aved me. If you refuse to let him go, I will kill your firstborn sons. And so we see this sort of household family relationship where God has taken Israel as, hey, they're my kids, they serve me, they can't serve another master. And what ultimately I think happens is this relationship of servitude, this relationship of Eved within the culture became a symbol of we're all going to serve something. As the great sage Bob Dylan said, we're all slaves to somebody, right? And
that was a great reference, by the way.
You're welcome.
That's actually my favorite Dylan album, The Slow Train Coming. And what's awesome about it is Mark Knopfler from Dire Straits does the guitar work. So anyway, sorry.
No, that's good. Well, if I'd rehearsed it more, I'd do a good Bob Dylan impression of that song for you, but I don't think that's this kind of show. But so all I'm driving at is that this idea that we all serve somebody. So God doesn't condemn Eved, but I think he condemns from our perspective what we look at as slavery and ownership and possession and oppression and abuse. But he does it in a way that says, look, the way to be freed from that is by becoming a part of God's community and becoming a part of, recognizing that your master is no longer of this world, but your master is God, the God who created you. And I think that's the theological strain. And actually, I think that's the question that came up. That's in show one. That's the part that struck me. Is I think there was a question. I can't remember who asked it or it came up. Say, hey, what's the more of a theological approach to this question? And that got me thinking about this. line related to some New Testament stuff that I could bring up later. But I think there's a parallel between the way it's treated in the New Testament and Old Testament to make clear that slavery, as we use that term, is definitely condemned, but it's done in a way, in a cultural context that maybe seems foreign to us, or it's hard to grasp. But I do think the dehumanizing aspects of that are directly gone against, but it does it through this relational context. And trying to move people out of those oppressive relationships to a relationship of aved, where there's care and concern and the ability to provide for future of folks. It's my general take on it, at least.
I'm just going to make this point real quickly and then cede the floor. But, building off of Joe's point, it seems to me that a lot of what we're seeing in Exodus, Leviticus, and Deuteronomy is actually putting in place structures that are designed to protect those people in Israel that would be vulnerable people, that would be otherwise marginalized people that are in a precarious position. So it really is a lot of what you see, as case law is really designed to be protective and to restrain abuse of those people that don't have power, whether it's economic or social power.
So, one thing that I think we need to sort of step back and bear in mind here is the similarity between broad ancient Near Eastern law from long before the Hebrew Bible and what we see in the Hebrew Bible. So, for example, the concern about the oppressed and the poor, you see that as early as, you probably see it in Urukagina's reforms, but certainly by, the law code or the law collection of Ornamu. And the whole prologue is about protecting the oppressed, protecting the poor, protecting the disadvantaged. The king is the shepherd of the people. This is where this idea comes from. So you see it even down through Hammurabi, who, I don't think anybody would make the argument that slavery didn't exist in the ancient Near East, outside of the Hebrew Bible, and yet the same concepts are in place. In fact, I think I probably mentioned this last time, but Hammurabi's law code is actually a little kinder to debt slaves in that you only get to keep them for 3 years and release them in the 4th. And to be very clear,
why is that kinder though?
As opposed to 6 and releasing in the 7th?
Well, yeah, explain why the assumption that 3 is better than 7? If the debt slavery was a form of provision for people, if they were taken care of, if they were provided for and fed, if you weren't in a relationship that you could provide for yourself, it could be bad to release somebody into a situation where they had no provision. So
sure. So
it seems to be an assumption of time there that doesn't necessarily directly related.
I'll show you how it's not. So so Deuteronomy 15 explicitly says, if we're going with a narrative text here, Deuteronomy 15 explicitly says after the 6th year, release them with mass amounts of provisions. So certainly in that case, the slave would be provided for. But by the time you get to Leviticus 25, and this is the real problem, I think, with this, this idea that slavery is not so bad, is that Israelites are, it's now illegal to make an Israelite a slave. So you expressly cannot make them an Eved. Going to places like Jeremiah 34, which, Fuzz mentioned earlier, the whole point was that they didn't release them, and that was bad. So, and in fact, if you read Deuteronomy 15, you'll see that by getting them, he says explicitly, you got twice the amount of work out of them, right? So, that's the rationale behind this. But, to be very precise about what it is that chattel slavery is being, described as here in Leviticus 25, because I feel like sometimes we just don't say it, and I think we need to. Foreigners are able to be kept for life. They're called achuzah, which is landed property. They're passed on as inheritance, and they serve forever. So, I just think we have to grapple with the reality of what it is that the text is actually describing.
Josh, I think, you're right that probably the passage that really demands the most attention is what we're supposed to be discussing today, but so far haven't. We're probably going to have to do part 3 or part 4.
Right.
But this has been a fun conversation. So, and I really, again, appreciate you coming on here and helping us through this and engaging us on these really challenging questions. But, to me, the idea of, I guess is a chusa in the original Hebrew, right, that is referring to the foreign Evid, right, and that they can be passed on as inheritance, and one thing that I noted is that most instances when this word is used, it's actually in reference to land, and so this is really in a sense you might say, quote unquote, an unusual usage to use it in the context of a person. And so, for example, when we go to Exodus 21, when there's talking about the relationship between a master and I'll use the term bond servant, and a owner and an animal, that the word used for owner or master is very different. So if that master is, again, with respect to the bond servant, it's adnon, whereas if it's someone who owns an animal, it's Baal. So it's very clear from that there was an attempt to distinguish between the relationship between an animal and the master, and so I wonder if a chusa here, again, given that it's used in an unusual way, is actually having a different context or a different connotation, and so, for example, you use the example of your car running and you running, likewise you could say, well, if I use the word dog, I could say, hey Steve, you dog, right? And that could be viewed as an insult, right?
No, I'm not really. No.
Or it could be used as a kind of a playful banter where it's really meant, in a not in a derogatory way, or if I say you dog, it could, refer to, again, an animal, a canine, right? And so, even though I might use dog most often, in reference to a canine, as you're pointing out, it would be wrong to then just say, well, because I referred to Steve as a dog, that somehow that connotation carries with it. And so that's what I wonder, is if that idea of property is really maybe not the best way to think about what's meant by a chusa. And I would build off of a point that Joe was making, though I think you disagreed with it, and that is that, for me, when I look at I see foreigners in Israel as people that are vulnerable, and this becomes very evident when we look at Leviticus, that connects the foreigner to the orphan and to the widow, that they're vulnerable people. And so by being able to enter into this bond service relationship as a foreigner who can't own land, in Israel, that actually is a form of protection for them. That is, they're provided for on a lifelong basis in exchange for their labor. And like if their master dies, right, that means suddenly if they're left out in the cold. But if they are able to transfer that, that contract, that work relationship to their children, to the master's children, that contract is inherited, then they are actually protected through the death of through the death of their master, right? Their adnon. And so,
I'm sorry, because this we're getting into a really long answer here, and I want to build off of what you're saying, Fuzz. The meat and potatoes of a transition in Leviticus 25, that in this last bit here that I want to hit, is that I feel like half of us are looking at a little bit earlier portion of Leviticus 25. I'm just gonna start at 39 for the heck of it for people watching, because we're referring to these passages and who knows what they say, right? So Leviticus 25:39, it's reading that if any of your fellow Israelites become poor and sell themselves to you, do not make them work as slaves. They are to be treated as hired workers or temporary residents among you. And then they work to the year of Jubilee. They'll be released, go back to their own clans, and to the property of their ancestors. And here's why. Because the Israelites are my servants who I brought out of Egypt, they must not be sold as slaves. Do not rule over them ruthlessly, but fear your God. Now that's great. We just made our point. Done. Christians win. Josh, go home. Bye-bye. So, but wait, right? Record scratch. Let's go on to the very next verse in 44. Your male and female slaves, so don't treat the Israelites like slaves, but your male and female slaves are to come from the nations around you, and you may buy them as slaves. You may also buy some of the temporary residents living around you and members of their clans, and they will become your property. You can bequeath them, not the Israelites, but you can bequeath them to your children as inherited property and make them slaves. But you must not rule over your fellow Israelites ruthlessly. So it sounds as though we're saying you can treat these foreigners ruthlessly, treat them as slaves. If your Israelite brothers and sisters have to sell themselves, you are to treat them like a servant. You're not supposed to treat them like this. And this was the question that I came to this show with, is why is it that the Christians, we stop very nice and tidy at verse 43 in Leviticus 25, but you go on to verse 44 from there on out, it's kind of a mess as far as our case.
But if you have to look at I think the totality of what you see in the holiness code in Leviticus. So, for example, Leviticus 19 says, "Don't mistreat the foreigner. They must be treated as native born. You love them as yourself." Leviticus 24, if you take the life of a foreigner, your life will be put to death. Fellow Israelites are to be helped just like a foreigner. Foreigners are considered vulnerable people that again should not be mistreated. That should be left gleanings, just like the orphan and the widow. So
that is a both and though, Fuzz, where it's both and. And what you're saying is true. But you can't. That doesn't wash out everything else that I just said about they can be treated as your property.
But I think you've got to read this in that context, right? That to me, what's the distinction here? Because again, the word slave there is Ebed, right? And so I see this as describing a lifelong bond service relationship that I see as a form of protection, as opposed to a form of a system that allows abuse.
Yeah, I would just say that, look, I think the way I'd respond to that is, again, I think we have to look at this sort of household mentality of, like the passage before, the context here is Israel is no longer the Eved of Pharaoh because they're the Eved of God. They're God's servants. But those who are foreigners are not a part of that system. So they live in this worldly system. And I think sort of it functioned as a sort of a living metaphor to people to say, look, when you serve and live the God of Israel, you no longer serve in these systems that are in the world. And I think that there's a couple passages that maybe amplify. I won't go into all of them, but I know that I lost one little passage I was looking at. I lost the passage, but it talks about foreigners, those who are Eved who have been circumcised could participate in the Passover, but those who were either Sakir, the hired workers, or the Eved, they could not participate in the Passover. So there's this idea that there's a relationship when even somebody who was an Eved, who was a foreigner, could show that they wanted to honor the God of Israel, that they entered into a new relationship and under, so to speak, that sort of protection of Yahweh himself. And so this idea, again, the foreigner, they could become an honored part of the household of Yahweh. I think Isaiah 56 is a good 6 and 7 is a good parallel to that, to think through at least what I see happening here. It says this: and the foreigner who joins themselves to the Lord to minister to him, to love the name of the Lord and to his servants, everyone who keeps the Sabbath and does not profane it and holds fast my covenant, these I will bring to my holy mountain and make them joyful in my house of prayer. Their burnt offerings a great sacrifice. And basically God says he's going to give them a great name in his household. So I think this idea of slave identity, no longer being identified as a slave within a world system, but under the direct, direction of God himself. I think you see God trying to make this point to Israel through the world they lived in. It's like it all makes sense if we can come up with in our lives, like if we can see analogies. We all love analogies, and we all love things or metaphors that help us understand. And I think in a large sense, I see that a lot of what Fuzz is saying about this, the purpose for how this system was done, I think was within that household mentality. And you see that carried through in Paul's treatment of slavery, which was very pervasive, obviously, in the New Testament period, and how that the identity of becoming a household of God changed that relationship. Not that master and slave no longer existed, but the quality of that relationship had to change because they were no longer, your possession. They're possessed by God. And as soon as somebody's possessed by God, then there's a different relationship that exists there. And I think that's
Joe. Forgive me, but didn't you just make my point?
I don't know. What was your point?
Well, my point was that there is a distinction when you go from verse 44 or 43 in Leviticus, and verse 44. There's treat the Israelites this way.
Oh yeah,
and treat the foreigners
I do think you're right
this way.
In that sense.
And you're saying, well, that a foreigner could become an Israelite through conversion and therefore be entitled to being treated more like a servant. So that's what I heard you saying.
No,
correct me if I'm wrong.
I think that there's a definite difference in recognizing the treatment, but I still would say that I think Fuzz is right in this sense. I don't think that treatment, if we look at all the prophets and all the whole ball of wax, so to speak, I don't think that different treatment of the foreigner as Aved and the Israelite as a hired worker, or even though I don't think that ever justified the abuse of the foreigner who was Aved. I don't think that's what this is ultimately saying in the context, but I do think there is a difference in how they were treated based on that household relationship. In other words, am I the house of God, or am I foreigner, to that house of God? Yes,
and I do see that analogy, and I also want to invite people. I can't be the only one that has questions here, so make sure that you're putting that in the chat, and so we'll be sure to get to your questions. Josh, you look like you're wanting to say something. Jump in.
Yeah, I mean, a couple of things that I just want to emphasize. First of all, the use of achuzah, Leviticus 25 is really the place to see how the word is used. So it occurs, I think, 10 times or so. I mean, it's like 10 or 11 times. And Fuzz is absolutely right. This is the only place that I know of where it's used about, with respect to people. But actually, I think that it doesn't go the direction maybe we would like it to go. So what landed property was, what achuzah was, is what this year of Jubilee was about, right? So you have Israelites, and Israelites are allotted a certain portion of land. And so if they become, and that land stays in their clan, their tribe, their family, all that stuff, it doesn't leave. You can't sell it in perpetuity. Like it has to revert back because the land has to stay with the family that it was originally with. So and that's what achuzah is. It's this landed property that stays with the family. So when the text says, if, an Israelite becomes so poor that they have to sell from their achuzah, from their landed property, by the year of Jubilee, it has to go back to them. That's it. You can't keep it longer than the next year of Jubilee. which had certain ramifications, which means when you come to Leviticus 25:44-46, and the foreign slave is called achuzah, they are handed down as if they were landed property. And that's why it says you can bequeath them to your children after you. They serve you olam, forever into perpetuity. It's because they fill that same category. They're part of that same category as landed property. It stays with the family. So, I mean, to be very clear about that, I think is really important. And two more things quickly. One, so many of the things that we've talked about when we talk about, again, oppression and not abusing and treating the foreigner well, these are all just general motifs in the ancient Near East. I mean, this is like, I think it's the laws of Eshnunam. I can't remember off the top of my head, but it says, if there are three different types of foreigners that are mentioned in the law, I think it's Law 41. If I got that right, I'm really impressed with myself. But it says
We're impressed with you, Josh, whether you're impressed with yourself.
That is totally misplaced.
Just say whatever it is, just say it confidently and people will believe you.
Yes, it's Law 41. But
That's
it says
my entire YouTube career, by the way.
It says if any of these three types of foreigners wish to sell beer, that the barmaid, the taverness, has to sell it at the going rate. And we look at that and goes, what it's saying is you can't take advantage of the foreigner, any type of foreigner, just because they won't know what the going rate is. She has to sell it at the going rate, not cheat them. This sort of thing is all pervasive in the ancient Near Eastern law collections. It's care for the poor, care for the oppressed, care for the orphan, care for the disadvantaged. That's what shepherding them was. But the thing is, that's not mutually exclusive with them having slaves, because they clearly did. And I think a good analogy to this in the Hebrew Bible is the discipline of children. So if you go through the Proverbs, we would be horrified today, right? I think to do what things like Proverbs 13, for example, say, but if you love your child, you will beat them, right? He who does not beat his child does not love him, or you beat them so they do not die. And we would say, well, wait a minute, aren't you supposed to love your child? Well, loving the child and beating the child are not mutually exclusive. So I think we have to be very careful. I think that's reading it through modern eyes. If we say, well, it says love the foreigner and don't oppress them, well, certainly you can't treat him as a slave then. That's reading it through modern eyes, because the text is very clear that you can.
That sounds like something, Fuzz, you might agree with Dr. Josh on that, about that we can't necessarily say some of these parameters that sound harsh to us are not loving towards the servant, the slave, or whatever. Am I right?
Yeah, and I think so. I mean, I didn't find anything to strongly disagree with in what Josh was saying. And just to clarify, I do think there is a distinction between I'll use the term bondservant that's a Hebrew versus a bondservant that's a foreigner. There are, I think differences. It's very clear. But again, I don't see this as being how we would understand slavery, or I don't see this as necessarily chattel slavery. And I think, Josh's analysis of the word achuza was really, really very helpful and insightful to me. And so I think you could see an analogy maybe between achuza in the context of a foreigner versus the land. So maybe I wouldn't say that it would be treating that foreign bondservant just like the land, but there would be that analogy that contract could be passed on, that it would stay in the family. But again, I see that as a form of protection for somebody whose security really rests on the fact that they are a member of a household, that they're provided for in exchange for their labor. So I don't necessarily see that as an abusive system, but as a system that offers them protection.
And I think that at the end of the day, I think that the catalyst for this whole conversation was, can we see a good reason in Scripture why God just didn't say, don't do it, don't own slaves? And Josh, just from your opinion, I want to know your opinion from coming from the other side, the not Christian side. If you, but you come from a historical and kind of more academic perspective of it. Do you see a reason why God wouldn't say just don't do it? And then I want to follow up with Joe and have him put in his 2 cents of his opinion on it.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's because they didn't consider it to be immoral. I mean, I think that's, from a historical perspective, you could ask the same question, I guess, about the Assyrians. Why is it that Asher didn't say, to the king, don't go and murder the people in the periphery when you go and, march against them? Well, they not only did they not consider that immoral, they considered it to be their duty. Those were sinful people rebelling against the god Asher out in the periphery, out in the west, and the Arameans, and I mean, these were people that were rebelling and fighting against the god of Asher. So, that wouldn't make any sense to condemn it. And I think the same thing is true. Why wouldn't they say, don't beat your kids with a wooden rod? Well, not only did they not think that was immoral, but they thought it was absolutely essential to do in order for the kid to live. I think the bigger issue for me in the theological answer, or the theological thread, is that it's not a matter of, saying Matthew 19:28 says, talks about divorce.
I'm going to jump in real quick, Dr. Josh. If anybody knows who's playing the piano in the background, because what you're saying is important, so if someone can give a shout out to bring down the piano.
I have my mic muted, so I know it's not.
But I think the bigger issue is not so much there's a precedent with divorce where we see the law doesn't always, it'll allow for things that, God didn't consider to be either ideal or moral or whatever. It's making a specific connection to slavery with that principle. And the problem is that, for me, is twofold. One, you have passages like Luke 17 where Jesus himself is using slavery as a metaphor. I mean, not even a metaphor. I mean, he is, but he's saying, which one of you, to his disciples, having a slave work in the field all day, and this is a personal slave of the household, when he comes in, which one of you would say, here, sit down and eat with me? No, you would say, get in there and make me dinner and wait on me while I eat. And then only after that, would they be allowed to eat? And so when you have done your duty, you're nothing more than worthless servants, which was a lesson for them, right? But the problem is that it hinges upon not only the reality of slavery, but it's an implicit, I think, or explicit statement that Jesus expects that the disciples would be doing just that. And the reason that I think this, and this is the last thing I'll say, the reason that this I think carries through this lack of condemnation and implicit, at a minimum, condoning in the New Testament, is that the early church wrestled with it, right? And their wrestling with it wasn't, oh boy, the New Testament sure does seem to say that we shouldn't do it, but we've been doing it for so long. It's the church fathers most of them had no problem with it. They would say things like, well, maybe we shouldn't have so many slaves because that's sort of gluttonous. Right? It took quite a while for slavery to work itself out. If the New Testament condemned slavery, I think the early church missed it completely.
Isn't this would be something along the lines of how we learn morals? I think a lot of this is kind of skirting the actual topic of the efficacy of God not stating explicitly, slavery is bad, right? So I did want to bring it back a little bit for a second on something that Joe had said way earlier on. I know we've gone way past that, but I'm not on the level to discuss the Bible like you guys are, so I have to bring it back a little bit. Because he had something about saying something along the lines of, we don't have laws unless there's a reason for them, as if after there's been a commission of a crime or something that they find to be egregious on the deological type of position. But I don't think that's the case. I think we have laws that we try to prevent things, right? We're not trying to be reactive. We're trying to be proactive, I think, a lot of cases of laws. Now, but that doesn't mean that morality-wise, we're proactive. I think a lot of it is reactive. We realize in society that something is detrimental, it's harmful to society, and we say, look, don't do this, right? Whether there's laws against it or not, we as moral agents go, hey, this is a bad idea. This is not beneficial to us as humans, as a societal collective. And back then, they don't seem to have learned this yet, right? They didn't seem to learn that slavery is bad. And I don't want to differentiate between chattel slavery and indentured servitude or whatever. To me, it's really a non-factor. As somebody who says, look, slavery as property is bad. As Dr. Joss has pointed out, if you can bequeath somebody to somebody, they're treated as property. That's it. I mean, if you can have ownership of somebody where you can bequeath them, that is treated as somebody who's not fully human. That is a subhuman characteristic of somebody who's treated as property. So that I find to be ethically disturbing. That was when I had said, why did not God say this is ethically wrong? And I think it was because people didn't understand back then that this was a wrong thing. This was normative back then. This is what, hey, yeah, let's beat our kids. Nowadays, that would be considered obviously criminal, right? Because we've learned over a period of time, this is something that we should not do.
Yeah, it sounds like Steve, you and Josh are on the same page that as far as culturally when it was written, that the reason, again, kind of devoid of an actual supernatural being, giving these, it's like the culture that wrote it, that it was not immoral to own slaves, so therefore it would be reflected in the writing. Now, Joe, I want to get your perspective on the question of do you see a good reason in Scripture why God didn't just straight up say don't own slaves? But before you start to unpack that, and then we got a couple questions to get to, I just want to thank Sean Carroll in the chat, because Sean says this is interesting and the level of civil discourse is refreshing. And so props to everybody here. This is actually really nice. I'm sure that all of you have been in venues where it's not quite as civil and a discourse as much as every man for himself. So yeah, thank you to everybody here, and thanks Sean for acknowledging that. And so Joe, what are your thoughts? What, from your perspective as a Christian, how would you answer the question, why didn't God just say don't own slaves?
Yeah, I think the big umbrella kind of summary I'd give on it again is I don't think we have this declarative don't own slaves or why condemnation of slavery, because as we've seen, that word for us has one concept, but there it covered a broad spectrum of social systems, and some of those social systems were beneficial. I mean, they didn't have retirement plans and 401ks and kind of like, hey, I got a job for, Enron or whatever. That's great. It's going to take care of me for my whole life. And then I can retire at 55 and live on the beach in Florida forever. Those weren't the systems that they lived in. And so to eradicate a system that was basically the only system for providing for many people, I don't think would make any sense. But I do think that there's clear moral direction of what was wrong. And I think the big picture was, look, just like in Israel, the land belonged ultimately to God. And that's why it returned to the people that God, through his covenant, had given to those tribes, because the ownership was ultimately God's. And humans are ultimately the property and owned by God who created them. And so we find different passages in Job and Ephesians in the New Testament talking about, hey, look, just remember, don't mistreat masters don't mistreat your slaves, because essentially God is your master in heaven, and he, remember that he has a way that he's going to be treating you. In other words, there's this idea of reciprocity in that relationship and what it signifies. I do think, just in the New Testament context, understand in the first century, in urban populations, there's some estimates that about a third of the entire city population would have been some sort of bond slave at any given point in that first century. There's some people who do numbers. If you talk about the slaves who were freed, because they could be, freed at about age 30 in most of those, in most cases. if they calculate that, they say, during the time the New Testament is written, about 85 to 90% of everybody living in the urban populations, especially the Italian peninsula, were probably current or former slaves. So you're talking only 10% of the people had never been or wasn't at that time a slave. So how do you say slavery is wrong when the entire system of the world does that? And so I think there's a way you do it with recognizing that, one, the church, especially in the New Testament, is not about transforming secular governments to meet a certain system. It's saying, how do we live within those systems in any time, in any age, in any culture? And you do that by laying down transcultural, transpolitical, moral truths that carry over in capitalism. I mean, the Bible doesn't condemn capitalism, but according to many of my young Christian friends, capitalism is the modern slave system. If I can, LeBron James says NFL contracts are a modern form of slavery. You can see people that say it's slavery, the college system of, how athletes are kept and used and stuff. So we use that to mean so many things. But I can tell you what's morally right and wrong, regardless of the label, based on those principles that guide us through that process. And I guess that's partly what I was trying to get across today. I think there's some undergirding principles to protect human sacredness that all are, again, that B'Tselem Elohim, the image of God, that I think we can find in those passages that sort of help us understand those difficult passages, which Dr. Josh is right. We have to wrestle with. And I'm not saying to gloss over. I'm just trying to give within my faithful couple minutes summary of how the framework I would use for dealing with that, I think, is there. And it's not, I may not do it the way we want it, but I think the idea of the oppressive, dehumanizing systems are condemned in Scripture, even if the label we want to see condemned isn't condemned in the way we want to see it condemned.
So it sounds like, Buzz, I'm gonna let you. Well, no, actually, because we can't do that asking because we got questions and we are. Well,
I just want to rejoin on that because
take that.
I know you want to rejoin her, and I love you, but no. So
so nice to her too.
I know. But it sounds. What's nice here is it sounds like there are points of agreement amongst all the positions. The part that the culture plays in, and the part that there is some parts that are protective. That the people actually. There was intention of good and putting parameters on things and limits on things. Even though, Dr. Josh said the Hammurabi, that the laws were even a little bit more generous, but Joe was pointing out God is also doing a bigger picture here of what this looks like in our lives. So I want to give Fuzz just a minute or two because everybody else has kind of gotten to put their little bow on why God didn't just say no. And then I do want to get to at least two questions here and bid everybody adieu at that point in time. So Fuzz, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think it's very difficult to try to find a modern day analog to what was happening, in the ancient Near East and specifically with respect to Israel, but to me, I think the closest analog would be essentially, as Joe was making reference to, essentially an employer-employee relationship. And I mean, there. For example, I work, and you see you work as well for reasons to believe, but I produce a lot of content that I don't own, right? The organization that I work for owns, and so in exchange for a salary, they assume the ownership of my labor, my productivity. And that's what I see the ownership being in the ancient Near East is it's an ownership, whether it's a Hebrew or a non-Hebrew bond servant, that ownership is not of the person, but it's actually of their output, their productivity. And in exchange for that, they are given, they are made members of the household. They are provided for. They have economic security, right? And they can, there are these protections in place to keep them from and their personhood from being violated. And so I don't see this as, again, a system that needs condemnation, because I don't think it's the same type of slavery that we saw that was horrific, that was tragically part of our history in the United States and part of the history of the Western world. I don't think we're looking at that kind of a system. And so I don't think there's a need to condemn it, but rather I see it as a framework it's a social welfare system, first and foremost, that protects vulnerable people who are in desperate need.
And again, there's like yet another point of agreement, that there are a lot of this is to outline ways to protect. It's like where you land at the end of the day. I think Steve is still pretty with his heels dug in, and he's pretty like, but still God could have just said no. And I think everybody else sees as nuances of like how that would have impacted the culture, and that there were other considerations. And so, that's where we agree to argue.
Don't factor in the cultural stuff, because I think ethics. Like I said, I do understand cultural relativism. I just don't abide by it. I don't think it's a really good way to determine efficacy. Maybe in a descriptive sense, like descriptive moral relativism, maybe. But I think when you had when Fuzz says talk about working for somebody and your work goes to somebody, and you talk about LeBron James. The problem is that anybody can still quit. Right. So it's not like the same thing. Right. I mean, there's an equivocation there, because when you say, look, I have a slave to my work. Sure. But I can quit anytime. I mean, there might be civil penalties, right? Contractually so. But there's no legal criminal penalties. Right. You're not going to go to jail for breaching a contract. Right. It's civil tort. I think there's a huge distinction to be made there.
And you do have a point. Well, all of our friends in the chat, they're coming out with all the questions now. And I've been watching and watching. It's like I think everybody was like so tracking that now they're like asking a million questions. But we're only going to have time to take on one or two. If you gentlemen are okay with staying around just a little bit longer, maybe take on 2 questions. You good?
I'm fine as long as you need to go.
Oh, here we go.
We'll be here until tomorrow. How long is the stream possible? 8 hours? Limit?
Well, here's one that I really thought was interesting. It's ROF, and I don't know if it's ROF 4 or ROF IV or ROF IB. So here we go. It's ROF. Couldn't this be explained by the concept of progressive revelation, or like a pedagogical thing where the people are maturing, and so therefore the laws, like Dr. Josh, you said by this point in time, it's clearly said as it's bad. And so that's what this person is saying, that it's a revelation of moral lessons over time. Joe, let me hear what you think of how that, if that answers the question. And then Josh.
Yeah, I know that question came up last time, and there's a little bit of disagreement between a couple folks on that. I think, but I do think that there is a progressive understanding. I mean, the Paul says that in the New Testament in this sense. He says, the law was used as a tutor. It was a shadow of the fullness of what was revealed in Christ, who was the fulfillment of the law. And so, from a Christian perspective, yes, I do think that. We have to understand what the law does. The law does not tell us what is all necessarily morally good. The laws can't really even make us do what's good. Laws can tell us what's wrong or evil, but they can't, and none of them can be comprehensive, because we can always envision some evil that isn't, within the letter of a law. That's why, when you go to the airport, they think, do not dismantle this, break or disarm. There's like 15 things you're not supposed to do to the smoke detectors, right? Because somebody thought, all these things that they different ways but it doesn't say I can't smash it with a hammer, So what I think the purpose of the law in the Old Testament was to point to, okay, this is slowly people within their context, and this is where Dr. Josh is right. They had a context, and God was speaking to people who were limited within that context. And I think he had to try to convince them quickly, this is what it means to walk in holiness to God. But there has to be a process to that, just like all of us have a process and a progress to life. But I think ultimately it gives us the moral foundation to apply it to our world today in a way that's consistent with the character and nature of God.
So, Joe, you would say that that when you see slight variations from one book of scripture to another book of scripture, maybe from I was just reading in Exodus to Leviticus, Amos, that it sounds like you would agree that there's a differing in the maturity, therefore a differing in the treatment?
There's a difference in maturity, but also, like I think Dr. Josh brought this up too, that it's casuistic law, it's case law, so it's dealing with circumstances as they arrive and applying some sort of principle to a different or, unique circumstance or something. And we don't always know the specifics, but we see what's there. So, yeah, I do think there is a change in some of the casuistic, the way the law is defined, but not in the ultimate nature of God who grounds those laws. I think there's a constancy there that undergirds those changing applications of that.
Okay, that makes sense. And Dr. Josh, would you? I don't know about the pedagogical thing, but as far as the casuistic, there you go.
Well, I mean, so sort of maybe to go back to the question, the problem with the progressive theological point, or trying to see this as God, doing progressive revelation or bringing the people along, is twofold. One, by the time you get to Leviticus 25, there has been progression, but the progression is only for the Israelites. So this question about how could God step in and take out an economic system or a social, help or social aid or something. He did, and he took it out for Israelites, the people that in this passage were in need of it. If that's what it was, then it was taken away for them. They were no longer allowed to be kept as slaves.
But didn't they have a replacement system then?
Right, and the replacement was a supernatural one. This is the point. Yeah. I think this is what the atheist and agnostic is saying, is that God can supernaturally intervene. He says he's going to do it in the text, right? The people are supposed to give loans at no interest, right? They're not supposed to keep them as slaves. They're just supposed to keep them as hired workers. All these things are economically not advantageous, right? So the problem that I see is that if we're seeing that as moral development, it's only as far as the Israelites. Then the second problem is if we're going to say, well, then by the time you get to the New Testament, that's where the progressive revelation has taken place. Nobody knew it. This is the problem. So, even if you want to make an argument that Paul is trying to do something with Philemon, Philemon, like I don't know of any New Testament scholar that's working with Philemon that would say that this is some broad application of condemnation of slavery. But the bigger point, I think, is that the early church knew nothing of this. So the progressive revelation, it's something that I don't think you have evidence for. If you want to read into it, I think you can do that. But I think you have to wrestle with the fact that you don't have actual evidence for it, like you have with divorce, for example.
And again, here we go. We agree to argue. Just to wrap it up, we got a question from Slammerin. Joe, regale us with the Hebrew on your shirt, and that will be the thing to bring us home.
For those that can, this is just B'Tselem Elohim, which is from Genesis 1:27. It just means in the image of God. And it just relates to this idea that all human life is sacred because all of us are made in the image of God. And it's part of my work and study to just try to say, how do we, in our own culture and time, when we're dealing with a lot of issues of race and racism and those sort of things, how do we make sure that we're all working to safeguard the dignity and the value of every human being in a way that transcends what's politically convenient at the moment? So, B'Tselem Elohim, that's it.
How appropriate to the conversation. I should have asked you that right out of the gate. So that is really, really good. Joe, thank you so much for joining us. And Josh, thanks for coming back. And don't worry, you don't have to make the face, nobody heard your chair squeak. You're good. Steve and Buzz, always thank you. And it blessed my heart to see that.
We're going to have to do part 3.
it blessed my heart to see the comments of the civil discourse, because that is what we're all about, and it just made me happy. So next month, this is going to be interesting about taking on science in the Bible 404 error. I know that people have a beef, like where Jesus says, if you have faith as the smallest seed, the mustard seed is the smallest seed, and it's like, no, chrysanthemum is the smallest seed. Or, from the four corners of the earth, which is like, obviously the earth is a cube. Just these different things that we have talking snakes and talking donkeys, and it's a whole Muppet show going on in there. And so these things are there scientific errors in the Bible. And Fuzz is he's gonna be unpacking that for us a little bit, and the understanding of that. And Steve is gonna be going at him mercilessly, and I'm gonna have to actually let him talk that time. So my apologies, Steve. So again, don't forget to follow us on social media. Agree to Argue if you want to see the shenanigans that go on, in the middle of the month. And I do want to mention we just had Fuzz's birthday, and Steve's is coming up on Valentine's Day, so send him lots of hearts because he loves that.
Yes, I do. Yes, please. I love being on Valentine's Day. It's just great,
So we had a great meme that our graphic designer Heather did for Fuzz about his dad jokes. So please go on Agree to Argue on Facebook, because you got to see that.
That's good.
Leave your worst dad joke there, please, because Fuzz loves them and he subjects his grandkids to them. So do that. And then she's made an awesome graphic for Steve that you'll see on February 14th. And it's just terribly cute. Yeah, be worried, Steve. That is really all I have to say about that. So next month, we will see you with bells on, and don't forget to bring your challenges, curiosity, and sense of humor again when we come together on Agree to Argue. Good night, everybody.